Hello, and welcome to the Extreme History Project Lecture Series. My name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the director of the Extreme History Project. And for those of you out there who aren't familiar with Extreme History, we are a local Bozeman nonprofit that brings history to the public in fun, engaging, and relevant ways, relevant being the word that we like to use. We do a lot of history programming. We have this lecture series. We do walking tours during the summer. We have a podcast called The Dirt on the Past. We do workshops that are focused on history in the winter time. So we do everything we can to get history out to the public. So if you want to learn more about the Extreme History Project, go on our website, extremehistoryproject.org, and learn about all the fun and exciting things that we're up to. Before we dive into our presentation tonight with Ellen Baumler, I just have a few housekeeping tips. We are in webinar format tonight, so you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you have questions, please write those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you have thoughts and comments that pop up throughout the evening, you can put those in the chat button, also located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of Ellen's presentation, you can ask questions. Actually, you can ask questions throughout the presentation, but at the end of the presentation, I will read those for Ellen to answer. For those of you in the Bozeman area, or those of you who are wanting to come to the Bozeman area, we are doing a Symbolism in the Cemetery walking tour next Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock in Sunset Hills Cemetery, our local Bozeman cemetery. I'll be leading the tour, and we'll discuss the symbolism on headstones and what it can tell us about the people who lived in Bozeman in the 19th and 20th centuries, their values and their ideas. So Cheryl, if you could put a link to that in the chat, that would be great. And you can click on that link and sign up for that tour next Wednesday. Thanks to everyone for your support of the Extreme History Project over this last year. We sure appreciate it. If you enjoy our lecture series, our walking tours, our podcast, or other programming, consider becoming a member of the Extreme History Project. It really helps us bring history to all of you in fun, engaging, and relevant ways. If you're in the Bozeman area, you can just stop in and sign up for a membership in our offices located at 234 East Mendenhall Street, or you can go to our website and sign up there. Cheryl is also going to put some of that membership information in the chat as well. She's also going to put a few other things in there about how to donate if you don't want to become a member but just want to support us. She'll put some of those links in there as well. I'm so excited to have Ellen with us tonight. She is a fellow taphophile, I think I'm saying that right, which is a lover of cemeteries. And I'm so excited about her new book called The Life of the Afterlife in the Big Sky. I've got my copy right here that I've so enjoyed reading. Ellen Baumler was the interpretive historian at the Montana Historical Society from 1992 until her retirement in 2018. She is the author or editor of numerous articles and books, including Girl from the Gulches, The Story of Mary Ronan, and Dark Spaces, Montana's Historic Penitentiary at Deer Lodge, along with so many other books. I think you're up to, what, 17, 18 now, Ellen? I'm not sure.
This was actually number 13. Yeah.
13. Okay, yeah. 13.
Appropriate for the cemetery book.
I was just going to say how appropriate.
Yeah.
Ellen has been honored with the Montana's Governor's Award for the Humanities and the Peter Yegen Jr. Award for Excellence and Distinction in Fostering the Advancement of Montana's Museums from the Montana Association of Museums. The Life of the Afterlife, her new book, was just released from the University of Nebraska Press, and it's her most recent project, and of course, the topic of this presentation tonight. So thanks for joining us, Ellen, and I'll hand over the controls to you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's really fun to do these programs, you know, after such a long siege of not doing them. So I'm really delighted to share some information with you tonight. So Montana has more than 1,700 documented cemeteries. And that number doesn't include forgotten roadside burials or plots in abandoned places, and the remains of once living people who thrived on the land for thousands and thousands of years. So my aim here is to explore with you the very earliest burial customs, consider a few individuals whose eternal sleep was rather rudely interrupted, and to explore the evolution of Montana's treatment and places of the dead. So some of you, or most of you maybe, have actually read about the Anzac child, which was a discovery in 1968 in Park County, Montana, that has had very far-reaching impacts. But here, my purpose in talking about this discovery is really to emphasize its cultural significance as Montana's oldest known burial. In the dim past, when mammoths roamed Montana's hostile landscape, someone laid this small child to final rest, dusted him with red ochre, and placed precious heirlooms, also covered in red ochre, over him. Tucked into a rock shelter, there he lay undisturbed for more than 10,000 years. Now, ochre is a mineral that's found in rocky outcrops. Archaeologists have recorded early burials saturated in ochre in the Baltic, in Europe, in Britain, Spain, Israel, New Zealand, and myriad other places. Methods and meanings, no doubt, have changed over thousands of years, but in diverse examples of very early burial rites and beliefs, the color red and the use of ochre is often a common thread. Ochre is the main pigment in the earliest pictographs elsewhere, and also here in Montana. And most anthropologists now agree that modern humans probably entered the New World via the Bering Land Bridge at least 15,000 years ago, maybe even more than that. Cultural practices came with these very early people. The child's gravesite is not only Montana's first known burial, but it is also the only Clovis period skeletal remains yet to be discovered in the entire New World. Clovis culture is among the earliest known in the Western Hemisphere. The first exquisite tools of these very early people were discovered in 1932 in Clovis, New Mexico, hence the name. And their stone weapons have since been found in the United States, but not associated with human remains. Only the Anzac site can actually make that claim. So these beautiful Clovis spear points indicate a very fine hunting prowess and the capability of bringing down very large prey like mammoths. Clovis tools span a millennium and then they disappear from the archaeological record. Theories for their disappearance include climatic changes that affected their food source or hunting to extinction the animals that ensured survival. While DNA taken from the Anzac child could not disclose the manner of death or health-related details, it did add significantly to the history of early New World inhabitants. The sample, the DNA sample, showed a 1 to 2 year old male descended from Asian and not European ancestors, supporting the migration theory that pre-Clovis people arrived from Asia, perhaps via the Beringian land bridge, and they may have followed the ice-free corridor south through what is now the Rocky Mountain front, and that corridor runs right through Montana. Fossilized bison antiquus, bone from these animals from this corridor dates to 13,000 years before present. Further support an avenue for the movement of animals and people. So the Anzac child's DNA is the oldest recovered in North America and links his ancestry to descendant indigenous American populations. Some believe that the beautiful Anzac site artifacts that are on display at the Montana Historical Society in Helena comprise a toolkit of utilitarian implements in various stages of manufacture. Some of the artifacts were new and never used, but some were much older and had seen use. In fact, one of them tested positive for rabbit blood. And another one tested positive for camel blood, which is really interesting because extinct camels, the Camelops hesternus, was among the animals known to roam in Montana. So the toolkit, these wonderful, wonderful stone tools, includes everything needed for survival and serves as a how-to manual showing the various tools in various stages of manufacture, which is, I think it's really, really cool. They're covering in red ochre, which was mixed with blood, in this case, rabbit blood, is indicative of ritual activity and a practice reaching back thousands and thousands of years. Supplying this child in death with everything needed for survival is evidence of belief in an afterlife. Thousands of years later, some of these customs remain even today. Montana's tribes, like others across the North American plains, most commonly interred their dead above ground. Red, as in the longest ago, continue to symbolize life's transition to death. Red blankets or cloth eventually substituted for the red ochre. Even in the dim past, caves and rock ledges may have been the graves, especially of prominent individuals, but open air interments like this one, which allowed the spirit to freely travel, were more common and are very, very ancient. The custom of open air burials persisted in Montana until the 20th century, when whites imposed earth burials because of health concerns. But even so, you know, these types of burials do continue today, albeit discreetly. The earliest burials reveal practices and beliefs that transcend generations. The desire to place the dead in strategic places carries over to the present desire to locate cemeteries in beautiful settings or to scatter ashes in places that were special to the deceased. From the dawn of time, objects sometimes accompany the dead as memorials to ensure a smooth transition to the afterlife. Horses, as here in the Russell painting, and dogs of the deceased were often killed to accompany the dead in the afterlife. I just point out the horse right here that has been killed. Consider the thousands and thousands of bones from these open air burials that were scattered to the winds across the big sky over thousands of years. The bones of others repose in mountains, across plains, in trees and valleys and hills, and beneath our cities, our towns, our roads, and our shopping centers. It's hard to imagine how many have walked in our footsteps and literally left pieces of themselves here. And it's poignant to realize that not all of those who were planted in Montana, like the Anzac child, for example, enjoyed uninterrupted rest. In 1937, Oscar T. Lewis, who was a Glendive rancher and self-taught archaeologist, discovered a circular grass mound on a bluff overlooking the Yellowstone River in Dawson County. It proved to be part of a rare 600-year-old earthen village, likely established by Crow Indians when they split from the Hidatsa and then moved west from modern-day North Dakota. The Hagen site, which was named for the landowner, is a National Historic Landmark and includes the mound, an earthen lodge, and 20 cache pits. The settlement may be the key to a crucial turning point of a people in transition from farmers to bison hunters. The mound, or raised platform, 45 feet in diameter and level on top, formed a perfectly engineered circle and contained large numbers of human bone fragments, mostly skulls, mandibles, or jaws, and teeth. Dr. William Malloy, who oversaw the excavations, concluded that it was a ceremonial complex. The skeletal remains represented many individuals, and some mandibles appear to have been violently separated with stone implements. Historically, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and other Northern Plain tribes interred their dead above ground or on raised scaffolds, as you see the scaffolds there in the background. While some groups left the dead to return to the elements, others gathered the bones for burial. The Mandan retrieved the bodies after the tissue disintegrated. They separated and bundled the bones, burying the skeletal remains, and placed the skulls, with separated mandibles in a mortuary circle, like you see here. Malloy believed the platform at the Higgins site corresponded to this practice. But in Montana, the dead were actually not usually grouped together, but they were laid to rest singly in remote and isolated places. It was a common belief that open air interment allowed the spirit to travel freely, and that belief persisted for thousands of years and continues even today. One source claims that scaffolding in trees was the most ancient and preferred method of interment among the Upper Missouri tribes. If the deceased was male, the face was painted red, then dressed in his finest regalia. The body was then wrapped in a blanket, and if the person was prominent, a layer of scarlet cloth completed the shroud. In ages past, painted skins served this same purpose. Weapons and personal items placed next to the bundle included everything needed in the next life, just like with the Anzac child. A tightly laced buffalo robe then encased the entire assemblage. Sometimes gathered skulls were also placed with the deceased, as you see in this particular tree burial. In later times, the body might be encased in a wooden coffin. If there were no trees around, then the body also might be placed on the ground, and stones or rock piles were placed loosely over the deceased. Like here, this is a cairn burial, and it looks just like a rock pile, but these were placed intentionally. And cairns, whether you know what they are or not, should never ever be disturbed or removed. And sometimes prominent individuals were interred in their lodges. As Christianity spread, some opted for burial in cemeteries, but open air interments remained preferable. Near the confluence of the Yellowstone River and Alkali Creek, which once flowed at the base of the bluffs that you see there in the center of modern day Billings, this is the Metro Park area. Several places recall thousands of years of occupation. Hundreds of River Crow lodges once lay below the rim rocks along Alkali Creek. In 1876, Lieutenant James Bradley noted petroglyphs carved into the face of one of the bluffs, slightly west of the present Metro Park. The Crow didn't know who did the carving, but they knew the name of the bluff. They called it the Place of the Skulls. An epidemic, probably smallpox, swept through the camp, and survivors told how bodies covered the area. Horses and dogs ran wild with no humans to care for them. The few survivors and others returned later to collect the scattered skulls. They placed them on a shelf that ran along the cliff face about 2/3 of the way up. The Place of the Skulls is today called Skeleton Cliff, and it's not the same as Sacrifice Cliff, which is on the other side of the Yellowstone. But faint surviving art on the cliff face below the Place of the Skulls depicts a crying round face carved into the rock through a layer of red ochre. The image, a combination petroglyph and pictograph, overlooks the Yellowstone River. And the face is unique among rock art in Montana, but it is similar to at least one example in Washington State. Oh, this is a really hard word to say. Saguglalal, or She Who Watches, at Horse Thief Lake State Park near the Dalles, dates from about 1700 to 1840. It also combines pictograph and petroglyph art and is near a burial mound. It also overlooks a river. The circles around the eyes may represent the sunken eyes of sick people. The Montana image is likely mortuary art that the Crow or some other tribe adapted from their Western travels. Whatever the origin, the crying image identifies the area as a place where tragic events occurred. And the use of red ochre follows cultural practices from the most distant antiquity. In 1877, the town of Colson grew below the bluffs in the center, sort of center right there of the photograph. You have an arrow there. I don't know if my image is in the way. At any rate, Dr. William Alonzo Allen, who was a Billings dentist and blacksmith, what a combination that is, was working in his Colson blacksmith shop, and he began to notice these red streamers fluttering over the timbered outcrop that was across Alkali Creek, right above the place of the skulls. So he investigated, and he discovered 100 or more tree interments. Red blanket shrouds had unraveled, and possessions of the dead littered the ground. The crying face petroglyph and the stories support the theory that the cemetery resulted from some dire event necessitating multiple interments, which were highly unusual at the time. Smallpox and such dire events disrupted cultural practices and resulted in multiple burials in one place. Of course, Montana had horrible smallpox epidemics. The first was in the 1780s, the next one was in the 1830s, and the last bad one, was in 1869 and 1870. So cultural practices, were disrupted because of these really terrible events. So during the trade era, most every trading post had its own cemetery, and time, weather, and shifting river courses and urban encroachment took tolls on many of Montana's earliest white cemeteries at forts and trading posts. And you can kind of see how urban development at Fort Benton, for example, prompted moving the original post cemetery and later even the 1860s county cemetery to the current Riverside Cemetery by the 1880s. Obliteration or preservation of early cemeteries depends upon two major factors. One is the continued relationships of the living with those interred in a place, and second, the need for progress. So Fort Khanna was a Hudson's Bay Company post founded near present-day Arley in Lake County in 1846. It operated under the Angus MacDonald family until 1871, and its surviving building that you see here is the oldest standing structure in Montana. The fort's well-preserved small cemetery includes early unmarked graves, and also Angus MacDonald, who died in 1889, his wife Catherine, who was a Métis of Scotch, Iroquois, and Nez Perce blood, who died in 1902, and their son Archibald, who drowned in 1888. Half a mile from the fort, the small family plots have been maintained by local MacDonald descendants and the Fort Khanna Restoration Society. But before the spread and practice of embalming the dead, the fear of awakening in a coffin buried alive was a very common terror. So sometimes bells were placed above the grave, attached to a string in the hand of the deceased. And this was a really popular custom. Although here in the MacDonald family burial ground, there's no string attached. The custom persists with these bells that were placed, decades and decades ago. And it's the only place that I have ever seen that. Catholic missions dot Montana's landscape and have well-preserved cemeteries, although the graves are often unmarked. Conversion to Christianity prompted cultural changes among Native people, including earth burials. St. Ignatius Mission and its cemetery were established in 1854. The mission burial ground was the final resting place for priests, for nuns, and for First Nation converts, Catholic converts on the Flathead Reservation. The cemetery eventually became full and many burials were moved to a new site. But there are a few scattered headstones in the 2 square blocks of the old cemetery where hundreds and maybe even thousands still lie beneath the sod. It remains a sacred place to the St. Ignatius community, and it is Montana's oldest existing Catholic cemetery. St. Mary's Mission at Stevensville was the first Catholic mission in the Northwest, established in 1847, but the original site, along with its original cemetery, has been lost. Reestablished in 1862, the current St. Mary's has two separate cemeteries. A Catholic cemetery, which is just your regular cemetery, and then also there is a Salish cemetery. Both of those date to the 1860s, and it's interesting to note that all of the Salish graves are unmarked. The endless stream of westward wagons intruded upon a long-established homeland, upsetting the harmony of thousands of years. The Thomas Massacre illustrates how retaliation was blunt and cruel. William Thomas, his 7-year-old son Charlie, and their driver broke from their wagon train despite warnings and traveled alone, over anxious to reach family in the Gallatin Valley. Near present-day Gray Cliff, other travelers a few days later came upon the Thomas party. Arrows pierced their bodies. William and Charlie had been scalped. Artifacts, the artifacts that were gathered there some of them were really unusual marking sticks that outlined the bodies. They were reeds tied with pods of cloth that you can see kind of there in the, here's a few of them here. It is assumed that tobacco is what was in those pods. But these and personal items were salvaged and then returned to the family. They included Charlie's well-worn square-toed boot with a missing pull strap. Its mate was never found. The three lie in a common grave off the frontage road between modern-day Gray Cliff and Reed Point. The site is a reminder of a point in time that our past is really not so different or distant from today. Once settlers began to add their dead to the soil, early graves were haphazard and most often they were unmarked. There were no local tombstone makers until the late 1870s, and even then the practice didn't immediately catch on. Wood was very scarce and tombstones had to be mail ordered to the local mercantile. Such heavy items were very expensive to freight, as you can imagine, before the railroad came. And often people were so transient that they had no time to wait for delivery. As late as 1883, when Helena inventoried its existing half-dozen cemeteries, only 1/4 of all the graves were marked. An official stated, and I quote, "Some of the noblest men and women lie buried, yet their resting places cannot be identified. After considerable inquiry, we cannot find that plot of the lots is kept. The county grave digger keeps no record of interments. He digs a hole and covers a corpse, and the name of the dead is buried in the same oblivion as his body." End quote. Documentation of deaths is problematic until the 20th century. Newspapers didn't always publish obituaries or death notices or causes of death. Epidemics were poorly covered in the press for fear of causing panic, and death certificates in Montana were not required until 1908. However, physical reminders of those who died with their boots on, that is, in some violent manner, and others who died too soon in Montana's mining camps and boom towns do exist. Nearly every mining camp left a burial ground, most often located upon the community's highest vantage point, as was the original cemetery in Helena. You can see the fenced family plots there in this 1875 panoramic map. Mining camp cemeteries like that of Helena, with many unmarked graves, are easily lost as residents move on, buildings crumble, time passes, and landowners develop or cultivate the land or use it for other purposes. Bannock, Nevada City, and Virginia City, however, fortunately retain their first burial grounds. Bannock's Boot Hill, north of the town, may be the state's earliest surviving community burial ground. It has the Bell Tombstone, which is one of Montana's oldest tombstones. It's hand cut and very crude, and the stone marks the grave of William H. Bell, who died in 1862. According to the History of Montana's Fraternal Order of Freemasons, the Vigilante Warning 3777 has nothing to do with the dimensions of a grave, as many believe. Rather, the 3 marks the first lodge meeting in Montana on Mullins Pass in 1862, when 3 members of the Fisk expedition opened and closed the first lodge meeting in Montana. And the 7 refers to 7 of the Masons who were among the signers of the Vigilante Oath, but the 77 refers to the funeral of William Bell. 76 Masons attended his funeral, and the 77th was the corpse himself. Its difficult accessibility and the desire for a more formal burial ground is probably why the community established a new cemetery around 1880. It doesn't look very new to me, but anyway, that is the new Bannock Cemetery. Montana's sister cities of Nevada and Virginia boomed with gold discoveries at Alder Gulch in May of 1863, and that brought an instant population. Nevada City's original cemetery is still in minimal use and has dozens of early unmarked burials, including those of George Ives, who was hanged for the murder of Nicholas Thibault in December of 1863, and of Nicholas Thibault too, who was his victim. Stones like these may mark some of the graves. They may be natural, but they also may have been placed there, but it's really hard to know. Virginia City's original Boot Hill is preserved thanks to the infamy of the 5 road agents hanged in 1864. The stigma of lying forever in the same cemetery as these accused criminals was repugnant to many of the early residents, prompting the opening of Hillside Cemetery across the ridge and the removal of some graves there. Not all those buried on Boot Hill, however, had loved ones to accomplish such a task. William and Clara Dalton, who died in 1863 of typhoid and not natural causes, as the signage would have you believe, were among those left to eternally repose on Boot Hill as their 4 children moved on. While some might believe that no one remains buried on Boot Hill, eyewitness accounts prove otherwise. Years after the hangings, in 1907, Lou Calloway described Boot Hill firsthand. He said that there were 2 lines of burials, one at the top of the hill and another slightly downslope to the west. 3 stones forming a triangle marked each anonymous grave. Adriel B. Davis, who had been an active vigilante and actually helped bury the 5 accused road agents, was still alive and helped settle the controversy, because Davis knew the order of the burials and pointed out the grave of George Lane. Exhumation of Lane's congenitally deformed foot confirmed his identity, and the graves, thus of the others, were able to be marked. The foot was removed, and the 5 graves were marked with the names for the very first time. The shellacked foot, with the sock still attached, was on exhibit at the Thompson-Hickman Museum until distant relatives in 2016, under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, reclaimed it, and the foot was cremated, and the ashes were then scattered over George Lane's grave. In the 1920s, the Daltons' grandchildren returned to Virginia City to place a commemorative monument on Boot Hill, and probably not on the actual grave site, which is unknown and was even unknown back then. They, along with Martin Lyon, who was murdered in January 1865, the 5 road agents and others with no family to exhume their loved ones and rebury them, most certainly rest there as well. Although Helena's first cemetery lies under Central School today, There's another property that might be termed Boot Hill. Unlike most places, Helena had a hanging tree that served its gruesome purpose at least 10 times, maybe 12 times that we actually know about. Some of the known victims were reportedly buried in the city or Catholic cemeteries, but others were most likely buried in a makeshift Boot Hill near the place of execution. Evidence has twice surfaced in what is now a residential neighborhood where the tree cut down in 1875 used to stand. One set of remains surfaced in 1900 when workmen digging a foundation for an addition on a Highland Street home uncovered a skeleton. A second set of remains surfaced in 1931 when workmen were installing gas lines in Davis Street. A pair of odd boots with fancy stitching that you see there, unlike the boots that others wore at the time, were found on this skeleton and matched those in this rare photograph of the hanging of James Daniels. So the town of Colson that I mentioned before was not a mining camp, but rather it was a river town on the north bank of the Yellowstone that thrived from about 1877 until the mid-1880s. The town was doomed when the Northern Pacific Railroad prompted the founding of Billings nearby. The short-lived community, though, had a very violent history where numerous residents died with their boots on. Colson's Boot Hill today sits in an unlovely urban setting overlooking Main Street, and it includes an unknown number of graves. Eventually, the few markers disappeared, and the site was little more than a pasture. But it was not forgotten. An obelisk marked the site in 1921, and in the 1970s, Boy Scouts added rows of crosses, but not necessarily on actual graves. Most early graves were unmarked, as I mentioned before, unless with rocks or crudely made wooden headboards or crosses. But as communities became more permanent, several early marble works opened briefly in the later 1870s and in the early 1880s. But A.K. Prescott was the first to establish a long-term monument business, opening marble works in Helena in 1884 and soon after in Butte. By 1890, his company had produced some 3,000 tombstones throughout Montana. His signature is found on many tombstones in many community cemeteries. So if you have a community cemetery close to you, always look for these signatures. Prescott isn't the only company that signed their work, but it is fun to see where they came from. The child's chair was a Prescott specialty, and there are signed examples in Bozeman's Sunset Hills, as well as Helena's Benton Avenue, and in Butte, I think it's in Mount Moriah, and also in Hillcrest Cemetery in Deer Lodge. Physicians in 19th century Montana considered an epidemic to be 5 cases of the same disease. Such ravages knew no social boundaries, and many Montana cemeteries reveal casualties, especially of children. The silver camp of Elkhorn flourished in the 1880s and has a particularly pathetic legacy. It's a remote but well-preserved cemetery, one of the really great cemeteries in Montana, I think, is perched high above the town on this wooded slope. It graphically tells the story of a diphtheria epidemic in 1889 that claimed almost all of Elkhorn's children. But actually just as tragic is another story. Later that same September, Harry Walton, 9, and Alvin Nelson, who was 10, had somehow escaped this epidemic. They found a quicksilver container full of black powder that adults used to detonate for community celebrations, and this one apparently had been overlooked. The powder exploded and blew the boys to bits. They share a common grave because their remains could not be individually identified. A proper burial ground along with churches and schools was one of the very first signs of a stable and educated community. Boot hills were necessarily haphazard and usually not permanent, prompting many Western communities to relocate their early cemeteries. Relocating a graveyard is unpleasant, but it is much more unsettling to encounter coffins and human remains unexpectedly. Forgotten cemeteries and family burials make grisly surprises. A few of these in Montana communities illustrate the problem. Beginning around 1866, the Missoula community's first dead were buried at the base of Mount Jumbo in what is now the Lower Rattlesnake Historic District, as you can see here on the panoramic map. It was between present-day Poplar and Cherry Streets. There are no burial records, but the cemetery was in use by the city until about 1884, when the current Missoula City Cemetery opened. The city developed a residential neighborhood on top of the burial ground, as shown in a plat map of 1889. Cherry Street homeowners are aware that there are potential remains buried beneath their properties. They're careful where they dig, and some homeowners have reported pieces of wooden coffins in the walls of their basements. In 1974, one Cherry Street resident was adding a porch to his house when the backhoe turned up 2 sets of bones encased in decayed wooden coffins. The bones, along with pieces of metal hardware and splintered wood, were turned over to the University of Montana's anthropology department, where several generations of anthropology students have since studied them. Over the years, students have solved some of the mystery, determining that one individual was a child and the other a female adult. Coffin hardware fragments were consistent with 19th century casket styles, but whose eternal sleep was so rudely interrupted. The style of the wooden coffin, which was narrow at the feet and wider at the shoulders, like you've probably seen these before, had silver handles, and this style was consistent with the 1870s and 1880s. Student analysis of the adult bones revealed a female between 25 and 34 years old with a poor diet and porosity of the bones, which could be indicative of tuberculosis. General Land Office records revealed that in 1871 and 1872, Cyrus McWork was the landowner there. On May 9th, 1872, Henrietta McWork Harrison, who was visiting her brother Cyrus, died of consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. Scientific analysis of the bones, including testing for tuberculosis, could further strengthen the hypothesis that the skeleton was in fact that of Henrietta Harrison. As teaching tools at the university, the bones of the 2 unidentified individuals have served an important function. In Helena, the St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery on Oaks was in use from the 1860s until it was abandoned in the early 1900s. This photograph is a very, very rare photograph, historic photograph of a cemetery. Cemeteries simply weren't photographed. The only reason that we have this one is because there was a lawsuit that was connected with the railroad tracks that are close by at the intersection. So that's the only reason we have this photograph. At any rate, in the 1970s, the city acquired this long abandoned property and created Robinson Park. A few families relocated their loved ones, but at least 1,065 graves remain undisturbed. Remains have surfaced several times from outside the park boundaries when city crews replaced water and gas mains. In 2004, several caskets came to light, including one child's casket with a viewing window and the words "Our Darling" embossed upon it. Workers unfortunately removed the 1890 newspaper from the casket that likely contained the person's obituary, thus preventing possible identification. Likewise, in 2018, more excavating uncovered some 7 caskets bordering the park. Both times, workers scratched their heads at the grisly discovery. And all they really had to do was turn around and read the sign recounting the history of the park. You know, so it's a really good thing, really good idea to research before you dig. At Clancy in Jefferson County in 2005, a backhoe operator excavating a basement for a residence in the newly platted Red Cliff Estates hit a metal casket. The impact broke the glass viewing window and dislodged the skull, which rolled out and came to rest in the sandy soil. Long dark hair, which was fashioned into a bun, hinted that the deceased was female, but there were no other identifying clues. Sheriff Craig Doolittle carefully extracted the casket with silver-plated handles and photographed it. The remains were then sent to the anthropology lab at the University of Montana. Research potentially identified the deceased as Evelyn Harvey Eddy, whose parents, Silas and Frances Harvey, were the original owners of Red Cliff Farm in the early 1870s. They built a house that you see here that still stands. Anthropologists determined that the skull was that of a female, and tracing Harvey family deaths, funeral home records showed that the burials of other Harvey family members were all recorded in Benton Avenue Cemetery, but there was no record of the burial of Evelyn, who died in 1887. For reasons unknown, her family apparently buried her in the field close to her family, to her childhood home, and her casket and remains were then quietly reburied in the Clancy Cemetery. While burials on family properties and semi-abandoned pioneer burial grounds continue even today, cemeteries of necessity became less haphazard as communities stabilized and grew. Montana's early cemeteries include interesting ethnic burial grounds. Many Slavic graves at Bear Creek, for example, display Cyrillic lettering, and many contain portraits of the deceased. Helena's Jewish Home of Peace, which is Montana's oldest Jewish cemetery, established in 1866, includes family plots gathered around a quaint brick walkway, much like a village neighborhood. And many communities have Chinese sections. This one at Butte's Mount Moriah preserves a rare funerary burner, which is part of Chinese funerary rituals. And a row of 8 Japanese headstones in Hillcrest Cemetery at Deer Lodge speak to the Japanese workers who replaced the Chinese in the 1890s, building the Great Northern Railroad and refurbishing rail lines into the 1900s. Following traditions, the traditions first noted in the Anzac burial, Native Americans and many other cultures too continue to leave familiar or treasured objects with the deceased to add to their journey to the afterlife. And there are unusual memorials too. For example, Agnes Merrill, who's a prostitute, has pineapples on the corners of her wrought iron enclosure. Pineapples, of course, are a symbol of welcome to visitors. And it's sort of fitting that she might welcome people to visit her. And this little puppy, longing for his master, perches on the edge of a tombstone at Main Cemetery in White Sulphur Springs. Montana's more elaborate cemeteries evolved from models that grew from trends in Europe and the Eastern United States. In the late 1700s, a movement began in Paris where health concerns over urban burial grounds and the exposure of human remains prompted the creation of Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1804, the first architecturally designed and formally planned garden park cemetery. By the 1830s, this idea had caught on in the United States, and small cemeteries were becoming extremely, grossly overcrowded. Where urban burial places were overfull like this, sometimes walls would collapse and flooding would occur. sending generations of burials one on top of the other out into the open. Floating coffins and exposed remains known in the South, in Louisiana in particular, this is known as bone gumbo, brought well-founded fears of spreading diseases. So beginning in the United States in the 1830s, the rural cemetery movement promoted the image of peacefulness surrounded by nature, a contrast to previous negative views of cemeteries. Rural cemeteries with landscaped grounds and romanticized monuments served a dual purpose. They alleviated the crowded conditions of the small, overfull urban cemeteries that many believed spread disease. They also provided recreational space, a place to reflect, and a place of history where young people could admire the deeds of ancestors and model their own lives accordingly. At a time when 43% of all children died before the age of 5, death was a common family companion. Mothers took their children to the cemetery to allay their fears of death. In Montana, some park-like cemeteries, such as Sunset Hills in Bozeman, were originally informally planned and evolved into places of public enjoyment. By the later 19th and early 20th centuries, Montana's larger cities began to cultivate formally landscaped cemeteries and artistic sculptured monuments. While cemeteries were usually located in rural settings, partly for aesthetic reasons, in Butte, health and sanitation made it imperative. Mining created underground disturbance, and early urban burials didn't always remain underground. Mount Moriah was one of Montana's earliest formal burial grounds, platted in 1877. It was less an aesthetic function, but more of a necessity since there was no landscape, just flat, barren soil. As much as the community wanted beautiful grounds, smelting polluted the area and nothing would grow there. Butte citizens made up for the lack of landscaping with fanciful and lovely tombstones. Consequently, Butte has the most unique and attractive cemetery art of any Montana city. Although landscaping was at first far-fetched, by 1905, as smelting centralized in Anaconda, trees and shrubs began to revegetate, and today Mount Moriah is beautifully landscaped. Missoula's city cemetery is an early example of the Eastern park-like model. County surveyor and civil engineer Harry V. Wheeler formally platted the grounds in 1885 in block sections with roads to the outside, alleyways for horses and carriages, and large hitching areas in square and circular patterns. With experience gained in Missoula, Harry Wheeler went on to design Forestvale in Helena in 1890. Although the 160-acre rural area was bleak and treeless, Wheeler created natural-looking, attractive settings with looping driveways, orderly plot rows, following the contours of the graceful loops, a small lake with a tiny island, and a grand entry gate. But among Montana's high-style cemeteries, the Charles E. Conrad Memorial Cemetery in Kalispell is the culmination. It incorporates the use of the natural environment with winding hilly pathways following the natural contour of the landscape, and it promotes the cemetery as a public park-like retreat. Professionally designed by Arthur Hobart of Minneapolis in 1903, it includes these great sweeps of lawn that have tombstones, but they are flat tombstones, so they can't be, you really can't see them at all. Alicia Conrad established the cemetery also as a memorial to her husband, and saw the passing of the first cemetery legislation in 1905 that allowed organization as a perpetual care facility. The Conrad family mausoleum is a focal point, but the ferry steps behind it are legendary. Cut into the steep cliff below the mausoleum, they lead to a carriage path which gave Alicia private access to her husband's mausoleum, to her husband's grave. So the evolution of Montana's cemeteries mirrors the state's development from pre-contact to the frontier, to fledgling camps, and to settled communities. If a community continued to develop and grow, Boot Hills and simple pioneer burial grounds usually gave way to formally planned cemeteries. Cemeteries became the last great necessity, and simple pioneer burial grounds cemeteries became the last great necessity and the mark of culture and education, where the dead could not only take their final rest, but also where the living could take their leisure. But traditions remain, and in the 20th and even into the 20th and the 21st century, cultural practices often dictate treatment of the dead. So in conclusion, it's important to know that human remains should be reported to authorities and left alone. A burial in a remote place doesn't mean that it was intentionally abandoned. Rather, it was probably likely placed there for a reason and deserves the same consideration as a grave in a formally planned cemetery. Many believe that exhumation causes a disruption of the journey of the dead. Whether a person lived 1,000 years ago or yesterday, that still holds true, and the dead always deserve respect. So while my book, The Life of the Afterlife, traces the history of Montana's burial grounds, it also showcases some institutional cemeteries like that of the state prison at Deer Lodge, the neglected cemetery at Warm Springs, battlegrounds that became burial grounds, and include some famous funerals like that of Plentycoo, for example, and special memorials to people lost in disasters like the Man Gulch fire, and even some animals like Butte's Auditor, Fort Benton's Shep, and my favorite one, Old Pitt, who was an elephant, buried in the parking lot of the Beaverhead County Fairgrounds at Dillon. I make no claim at all that Life of the Afterlife is in any way a comprehensive work. There are so many worthy Montana cemeteries that are not included, but my hope is that the book will spark interest in your own local communities and foster not only better appreciation of these places, but also encourage their unknown stories to come to light. So lest we forget those first Montanans who came to this land and whose dust lies scattered across our mountains, our hills, and our plains. On a rainy Saturday morning in 2014, a small group gathered around a sealed box holding the scant remains of the Anzac child. He gave the scientific community incredibly valuable information, but it was time for closure. Tribal elders and scientists came together for this reburial, which was a compromise between the potential for further knowledge and native tradition. The Anzac child's potential to teach future scientists ended, but with closure, all present hoped that his spirit could at last find peace. And I would be glad to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was wonderful. What a great look at Montana cemeteries. We do have some questions. If anyone wants to, again, if you have questions and you'd like to ask, just go ahead and put that in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And we did have a question about burial laws, and you kind of addressed that, but maybe you could go into it a little bit further. Colleen asked, I lived in Wisconsin for 30 plus years, and Wisconsin has a law that protects graves from disturbance. The relatively recent unintentional disturbance of graves is very disturbing. What is the legal status of graves here in Montana?
Well, the Repatriation Act covers those burials, and I think it is illegal to dig up anything like that. And we do have a burial board that presides over remains that have been found and determines where they should be repatriated or if they should be. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really go into it in too much detail, but it's a rather recent thing actually for Montana to have those laws. They came about in the 1990s, I believe, when it was discovered that the Smithsonian Institution had a lot of human remains that they were displaying that should have been repatriated to Montana. And so I think because of that, there are other laws that followed. And, you know, I don't know whether our laws are stricter than other places, but I do know that they are, the letter of the law is followed.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. A question from Brian Stacy. He asked, do most cemeteries keep records? Where can you find records for abandoned cemeteries, or are these just lost?
Oftentimes you can't find them. It depends on, you know, where the cemetery is, when it was, who was taking care of it, for one thing. If it's a family, you know, if it's a family burial ground, sometimes there are records in Bibles or, you know, just within the family, but oftentimes there really aren't records. And it wasn't until 1908 that they required death certificates. So, you know, before 1908, it can be problematic to discover who's buried where. It just depends on the place and depends on who has caretake that place. And, you know, I know at Benton Avenue Cemetery in Helena, the early records were burned. And oftentimes, and that happened in Fort Benton also. Courthouse burned, and that portion of the courthouse burned, and so did the records. So it just depends on the place.
Brian said, I'm most interested in Helena City Cemetery near the Poor Farm.
There are some records. If the person died after 1908, you can find those records. I suggest that you take a look at the National Register nomination for the Poor Farm Cemetery, and that will give you bibliography, and perhaps you can find some things. I know that there are records on some of those folks.
That's great. So you have another question from Richard Brown. He said, Ellen, where do you find the significance of 3777?
Where do I find the significance?
Where did you find that information? I think
it's
maybe
in the History of the Montana Masons, called the Hands of the Workmen by Miller, and that is detailed there. And you can find that book on Amazon. I have a copy that I got on Amazon.
Okay. Yeah, that was fascinating. That was interesting. You know, you hear all these different reasons why, and I heard
that's the only one to me that makes sense.
Yeah.
Most of them are pretty far out there, I think.
Pretty outlandish.
Pretty folklore-y.
Jessica Jones also asks, what is your favorite cemetery in Montana or in general, and why? Good question, Jessica.
Yeah, we were just talking about that a little bit before the program. You know, I have to say one of my favorite cemeteries is Hillcrest in Deer Lodge, because you know, for one thing, W.A. Clark had two little girls that died. And that's one story that I think is pretty interesting. There's a very elaborate tombstone there to those two girls. There's also one of those little chair tombstones. And there's also the prison cemetery is there, which is very interesting to me, since I've written a book about the history of Deer Lodge prison. And that cemetery to me is one of the more poignant places, I think, in Montana. And then there's also a very interesting mausoleum there that was built for one family, and a woman built it for her husband, and then she remarried and didn't get buried there. So, I mean, I think some of those stories are really interesting. And if you know, most cemeteries have those kinds of stories. You just have to look for them.
That's great. That's great. Lois Roby from here in Bozeman asked, do you know if the cemetery at Fort Ellis was ever located?
You should know that, Crystal.
I
Why
know
don't
the
you
answer
answer
to
that question?
So Lois, yeah, there was some magnetometry done at the Fort area of Fort Ellis that I helped with, and we think we did locate the area of the cemetery. Most of the people who were buried in that Fort Ellis cemetery were removed to the Fort Missoula cemetery, but there may be a few people remaining. That's a question we'll probably never have answered. But Ellen, would you like to add to that at all?
No, just that, they were closing those forts in the 1890s, and every fort had a cemetery, and most of the fort cemeteries were closed and the remains were moved to Custer National Battlefield Cemetery or Fort Missoula or Fort Harrison or other more recent forts. So, I'm trying to think of examples. Fort Keogh, I think there was maybe a person buried in that cemetery, and that person was moved. In fact, there was an old cemetery at Fort Harrison that was closed, and those folks were all moved also. Fort cemeteries, there tend to be better records for the military,
Right. Cindy asked, have you ever run into anything that could be described as ghosts, haunting, supernatural?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Read my book, Haunted Helena. There is, and I have to say that Benton Avenue is the one cemetery that I don't think cemeteries are usually haunted. I think a lot of those stories are made up. But I happened to be there when a pretty profound event happened 2 different times at Benton Avenue, and involved 4th graders, 80 4th graders, as a matter of fact. So I would read that story because that is a real true story that did happen in a cemetery that I was there for.
Yes, yeah. Tad Weaver asked, the size of lichens on gravestones increases with time. A study of this relationship allows extension of the information to age the stones at other places. The technique has widely been used in Europe, even to age Roman era stones. And so it's, it's shame to have our gravestones sometimes cleaned of this lichen and destroy some of this dating potential. So Tad Weaver is a professor in ecology at Montana State University, and he's also a Montana State steward. So we've talked at length about lichen. So Ellen, can you speak to that a bit?
I don't really know anything about that. And whether or not a stone should be cleaned, I guess probably depends on what else is going on in that cemetery and how the other stones are being treated so that they're, uniform, I guess. I've taken those cemetery workshops from Jonathan Appel, and he does advocate cleaning the tombstones and cleaning the lichen off. But I'm sure there are conflicting opinions about that, and frankly, I don't really know which is the better thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ellen. How do the reservations handle modern versus traditional burial practices? And that's from Leslie.
Yeah. Well, I probably should be very careful in addressing that because it's really not my purview, really. I know that it depends on the family. It depends on the family's wishes. Modern funeral homes are always willing to work with Native Americans and honor their traditions, although it is illegal for open air interments. I know that still happens. And so maybe we should just leave it there.
Okay. Teresa asked, your presentation has reminded me of school friend's mother in the 70s or 80s, 1970s or 80s, having a hobby making charcoal etchings of historic gravestones. Was that a popular hobby? Are there collections of etchings like that you know of?
It was a popular thing to do, and I know that there probably are. There are a lot of collections of ones from England that I'm familiar with. Those tombs of knights and things. You always see those etchings or those rubbings, they're called. But now, we really discourage that because it is hard on the tombstone, number one, and number two, tombstones are often unstable, and it's no joke that they can fall over and kill someone, so it's not a good idea to put any kind of pressure, on a tombstone.
Good question. Good question. Yeah. So, Ellen, I just wanted to ask about in the news, of course, in the last month or so, there's been a lot of ground penetrating radar done at residential schools in Canada, and then, of course, in the United States as well, and an outcry about the mass burials being found. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
There are mass burials in a lot of different places, and usually those, would not be marked. In fact, COVID has precipitated some of those mass burials in various places around the world. I don't know what you want to do about it, if there's anything to do about it. Ground penetrating radar is probably the only way that you can, for sure say whether it's there or not. And even then, that may be not definitive. And whether or not exhumation is the proper thing, I guess it depends on the situation. I know that they were exhuming or trying to exhume a number of the bodies in the terrible event that happened in 1921 that's been on the news lately, where so many Black people were killed in
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
In Tulsa, yeah. And so I know that they were doing ground penetrating radar, and they were doing some exhumations in order to identify family members. And so if there is a family member, that wants to identify a loved one, that's one thing. And that may be, it would have to be court ordered probably to, do an exhumation like that. But for those mass ones, I don't know what to say. It's a very tragic thing.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is.
We know that they are there, but I don't know what you can really do about it. Or if you should, exhume them, I don't know.
Right.
I guess it depends on the situation and who is involved, if it's family members or what.
Right. All right. Well, that's the end of our questions. So thank you so much, Ellen, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
I hope this encourages everyone to go out and walk through a cemetery and learn and appreciate your local cemeteries. They're beautiful. They're places of art. They're places of local history, of course, as we've learned tonight. So I just wanted to mention also that here in Bozeman, we do have another cemetery tour that happens every Sunday at 4 o'clock. With the wonderful tour guide, Jessica Jones, who is on the presentation this evening as well. But she does a more of a history-based tour of our local Sunset Hill Cemetery. So if you're from the Bozeman...
It's a wonderful, wonderful cemetery too, and there's so many interesting things about it.
There is.
Oh, if you're in Bozeman, go.
Yeah, but I encourage everyone also to buy the book. It's out everywhere. You could find it in your local bookshop, I'm sure. Here, I know I'm sure they have some at Country Bookshelf here in Bozeman, but at any local bookshop, or if they don't have it, have them order it. And then, of course, probably on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or all the big places too. But Thank you so much, Ellen, for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and hope you can join us again for another Extreme History Project lecture. Good night, everyone.
Good night.